Hello and welcome. In this lecture, I'd like to walk you through the implementation of creating your own content provider. So let's bring up Android Studio. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new project, which will be our content provider. So we're going to create a new project and we're going to name it My Content Provider. So let's close this one. Let's start a new Android Studio project. Let's call this My Content Provider. Since it's our own content provider that we're going to create, we're going to keep everything as default. Hit the next button, minimum API 15. And we're going to say add no activity because this is a content provider that accesses a database. We don't need to have an activity for this. So we're going to say finish, and it's going to create an empty project essentially. Our manifest file does not need to create any activities, and we don't need to have any layouts. All we need to have is a Java source file. So we're going to go to our projects and we're going to go to source and we're going to create a new Java source file inside of our package. So we're going to name this My Content Provider, or better yet, My Provider. I'm going to say new, and we're going to say new Java class, and we're just going to say My Provider. And My Provider is going to extend the content provider class because in order to create our own content provider, we have to extend the content provider class right here. So we're off to a good start. We're creating our new content provider. Our content provider is going to be wrapped. We need to identify our data source. The data source that we're going to need to communicate with is a database. So before we implement the provider, we have to implement the database. So let's create another class called Database Helper. And this is going to be very similar to our Database Helper from our previous section. So inside here, we're going to name something Database Helper. And the superclass for Database Helper is going to be SQLite Open Helper. And this class is going to be our interface to the database. And it's going to be very, very similar to our old section. So a lot of copying and pasting here. This is extending our SQLite Open Helper. Remember from our last section that we have to create table and table columns, and we have to create the database name and also the version. So let's add those as member variables. And you'll see here that I'm creating my database schema. I'm creating my table name, employees. I have my ID, name, and address for my columns, my database name, myemployees.db, and my version. The only other member variable we need is our database, our SQLite Open database. This is the instance that performs operations on the database, the CRUD operations. We then need to implement our constructor. Remember, our constructor in our SQLite Open helper, it creates the new database. So when you create an instance of the database helper, the database gets created if it hasn't been created in the past. We also have to create our table query. And then we know from the past that in order to implement the onSQL or the SQLite helper, we have to implement two methods, the onCreate and the onUpgrade. Our SQL string query to create the table, we're creating an employees table, and we're creating three columns, our primary key ID, our name, and our address. We have to create the onCreate and onUpgrade. So we're going to add those. Our onCreate just creates the table. Our onUpgrade will drop the table and then call the onCreate to recreate the table. Because if we upgrade, we're going to change the schema and we have to recreate the table. We're going to have open and close methods for our database. The open method is going to get a writable database. Close method is going to close the database. We're also going to add our CRUD operations. We're going to add a add method, a query method, update method, and delete method. And so these methods will have to support the content provider. So you have to remember that for the insert method, we're going to need to take a content values instance as a parameter. For the query method, we're going to need to take a projection, a selection args, and a sort order. For the update, we're going to need to take content values, selection, and selection args. And for the delete, we're going to need to take selection and selection args. These CRUD operations in our database want to be the same as the content provider CRUD operations. They want to take the same parameters that those operations take. And if you remember from our previous lecture, when we described these implementations in our content provider, each one took specific parameters. Our add method took a content values instance. So when we implemented this database before, our insert or add method took 2 parameters, the data that we wanted to insert. Now, when our content provider calls this, we just pass it into content values. Our content provider is going to populate the content values object and then call this method. So this method is pretty simple for our add. We just say database.insert and we insert the content value passed in as a parameter. The query method is also going to be somewhat simple because all the data is going to be populated in the content provider call. So query is going to take a projection, a selection args, and a sort order. We're then going to just say database.query, table name, projection, selection args, and sort order. We're just passing in the data to the query method from what's passed into our database method. And then we want to return the cursor. So again, this is similar to our content provider. Our content provider has to return a cursor when it queries. So our database open helper is going to mimic that. Our update method is going to take content values, a selection and a selection args, and we're going to again pass those parameters into our update method on our database, passing the data, the table name, and all the other ones. And then we're going to return a count. So these methods, again, are pretty simple because they're just wrappers. The content provider is doing most of the work to populate the content values and the selection args. The last method we have to implement is the delete method. Delete method is going to take a selection and a selection args and then call the delete method on the database, passing in those parameters. And so the database portion is somewhat simple. We've already done this in a previous lecture and a previous exercise, so we know what this is all about. This instruction is all about implementing the content provider. So for now, we're done with our database. Now we can go back to the provider. And so we've implemented the CRUD operations in our database, but we haven't implemented the CRUD operations on our provider. Before we implement the CRUD operations on our provider, we really should create a contracts class. Our contracts class defines, exports all of the data that clients can use, the content URI, all the column names. So at this point, I want to create another project, a new Android project, and let's make sure this one is saved. This new project is really just going to contain one class. It's a contract class. So let's say new project. Let's call this one our My Provider Contract project. So My Provider Contract. And we're going to leave the defaults same. API level 15. We don't want to have an activity. This is just a single class. And we're going to say finish. Now this class is going to be even simpler because it's going to contain one Java file that contains static member variables. So we can create a new Java file inside of our package. And did I accidentally? Just want to make sure I didn't create a layout. And inside here, we're going to just say new Java class. This class does not need to subclass anything. It's just My Provider Contract. And this is where we're going to define all of our static member variables that can be accessed in other projects. So we have to define the authority. The authority, remember, is our fully qualified class name or our package name. It has to be a static final variable. The reason we make it static and final is we don't need an instance of this class to access it, and it's a constant. It's never going to change. So we have authority. It's com example L user my provider contact, and actually this should be com example jfetid. We then want to create our base path. Our base path is our table name. Our table name is employees. We then want to create our content URI, which includes the authority and the base path. So here, we can just concatenate those two strings. Or you could call that nice method that we described in the lecture. Concatenation is just as easy. We can say content URI equals UI.parse, content : / plus authority plus base path. Now remember that we also want to do updates and deletes in our content provider. So we need to pass in an ID. what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to create a content item type for that and a content type for our employees. And we'll see how these become useful later on. So we're going to create a content type, and that's going to be pointing to our employees table. We then want to have another content item type that points to a single employee. And this will be used for the update and the delete. This is going to be used, this content item type is going to be used when we want to pass in our ID as part of the path. And that's it. This is our single class in our project. We don't need to do anything else with this project. This is our contract that exposes all our external data to our clients and our content provider. I want to make sure this is a library. I don't want it to be an Android app. So if I go to my manifest file, I can change this to be a library. Also, when I created it, I should have probably selected, you can't select a library here. I could have created a new module here and said new module and then selected a library, Android library. But since I didn't do that, I can just convert it to a library by going to my Gradle settings. So if I want to convert this, right now this is an Android application. And because I want to use it in other Android applications, I want to change this to a library. So I can go to my Build Gradle module app settings, and where it says Apply Plugin, I can change this to COM Android Library. And then I also have to get rid of the application ID. And now this project will be a library. So I can say Sync Now. And when it builds this, if I build this, once it's done syncing with Gradle, it will build a library. Sometimes, besides just building, if you want to generate, an Android has libraries in AAR, a Java library is a jar, an Android library is an AAR. We can build the AAR and then link to it in another project. If we go to View and we go to Tools, Windows, and we go to Gradle, we can select our app, our module that we want to build as a library, which is app, and we can say Assemble. And when we say Assemble, this is going to generate an Android archive file. And it did it pretty quickly. And that Android archive file is going to be located in our project directory. So if we go to My Provider Contract, and I go to Build, or My Provider Contract, and I go to App, and then I go to Build, and I go to Outputs, we go to AAR, we'll see that we have an Android archive that we can link to in other projects. Because remember, this contract class needs to be seen in other activities. So now we're done. We made this a library. We can use it in other projects. So let's close this project. And in our My Content Provider, let's link to this. Well, instead of linking to this project, let's just import it because I may need to modify it. We could link to it as an Android archive, but if we want to import it, we can just select File, New, and we can say Import Module, and then we can go to our source directory of this module, which is My Provider Contract and the app module. So we'll have to rename the app module, maybe My Provider Contract, and then say Finish. So you'll notice that this will then be brought in as a app inside here, My Provider Contract. We can modify it and we can compile it. If we just link to it, we wouldn't be able to modify it. So we can see it. So now, if we go back to our app, and we go back to our My Provider class right here, we can import this package. We can say, or better yet, it can import automatically for us when we try to use it. So we know that the name of the class is My Provider, or My Provider Contract. So if we say My Provider Contract, and then we say .authority, we should be able to import that. So we can say, oh, before we do that, so all we've done so far is we've included the project, My Provider Contract. We haven't added a dependency there yet. So we have to add a dependency by selecting our project, going to File, Project Structure, and then adding a dependency to our app which is my provider contract. So we can select the app, we can say dependencies, we can hit the plus button, and we can say module dependency. And here we can select my provider contract. Now it will know to import it. So we hit OK there. Now we can use all those static member variables by saying my provider contract and accessing them like that. So now we have access to our contract. We can finish our implementation of our provider. Our provider's implementation is we're going to need a member variable for our database helper. So we want to add that. That's private. We also need to create a URI matcher object. The URI matcher is going to make sure that we only accept requests from valid content URIs. So we're going to create a URI matcher instance, and we're going to initially say no match. We can use this URI matcher to make sure that our content URIs that are being invoked by our clients are matches, that we're only going to operate on 2 tables, or one table, the employees table, or an employee that passes an ID. So we're going to create a static block here. And we create a static block here because we only want this to be called once. So in the static block here, we're going to add the two valid URIs to this class. The 2 valid URIs are the authority with the base path. This is our employees. And then the other valid URI that we're going to accept from clients are authority base path and then a /number. The /number means an ID. So we're going to add those to our URI matcher. And then in our query method, in our CRUD methods, we're going to make sure that if we get any requests from either of these 2, we can only allow requests from either of these 2, and then we'll do something specific. So this is just a matcher to make sure that our clients are calling the right content URI. And if we get requests from other URIs, we're not going to do anything. We're trying to match the valid ones. And remember, we have 2 content URIs for this class, this provider. We have our employees table, and then we have our employees table with a number, an ID, in order to do updates and deletes. So we have to first implement the onCreate method. The onCreate method is just going to create the database. And I know it said that we don't want to do creation of databases on onCreate. What that really means is we don't want to get the writable database, because that's an expensive operation. Creating the database by itself is fine. And it only happens once when the content provider gets initialized. We want to do the get writable database in our CRUD operation. So here in our onCreate, we're just going to create our new database helper. We then have to implement the CRUD operations. And then once we implement the CRUD operations, our content provider has been completed. We then need to use it. So let's implement before we implement the CRUD operations, the other method that we have to implement for a content provider is the get type. And the get type usually will check the MIME type and then return the right content URI. But we're not going to do that. We only have 2 content URIs. We're just going to return null. We're not going to check any type. This would, again, return the correct type. This is more of a helper method, so we're not going to implement this. Our insert method, or our query method, which we'll implement first. The query method takes specific parameters that we have to override this method, because remember, we're a subclass of the content provider. So we have to override insert, update, delete, and query. So the query method takes the URI, the projection, selection args, and sort order. The selection and selection args are the where clause, and the projection is the tables that we want to look at. The sort order is how you're going to sort the data. So inside here, the first thing we have to do is we have to determine where the query is coming from. Is the query meant to be for all the employees, or is it meant to be for a single table? Well, we are not going to support queries for a single table. We're going to only return all the employees. If you wanted to do a query that passed in an ID and returned one record, we could support both of our content URIs. But for query, we're just going to support the employees table. So we're going to have a switch statement that checks whether or not we have a match on the URI passed in. So the URI that's passed into the query method, this is the client's URI. This is what the client's URI is calling. Now, is the client calling the employees content URI to retrieve all, or is it calling an ID? So here, the other important thing to notice is when we added our URIs, our last parameter is our code. We can put anything in here, and then we can use that code to do our matching. So for our employees table, used for the update or used for the query and insert, we're just going to say that's 1. For the update and delete, we're going to say that's 2. And the update delete can actually handle both. You can update multiple records without a where clause, or you can update a single record with a where clause. When you update a single record with a where clause, you're going to look for URI 2. So the query method, we're only going to need to match our first content URI. If we match our first content URI, we're good to go. If they try to call a client tries to call the query method and passes in an ID, we're going to throw an exception because that's not valid for query. So now that we've checked that the URI is good, all we need to do is open the database and call the query method on the database. So we can say myhelper.open, we can say cursor, call the query on our database, passing in the parameters that were passed into the query method. Pretty simple. The last thing we want to do is we just want to make sure that our listeners are getting notified. So we're going to call set notification URI. And then we're going to return the cursor. And we've implemented our query method for our content provider. The next method we're going to implement is the insert. The insert is going to be similar to the query in that you can only call an insert method if the client's URI is asking for the employees table. So we're going to get our long ID equal to 0. And we're going to say myhelper.open. And we're going to now check for case 1. Remember, case 1 is our employees content URI. If they passed in case 1, we can just say myhelper.add, add in the content values that were passed in. So remember, the client populates those content values. We just add them to the database. If they try to call this insert method with a content URI for a single employee, we're going to throw an exception. Also, let all the listeners, all the clients know, so we're going to call notify change. And then remember that the insert method, we have to return a URI. And what do we want to return for the insert method to the client? We're required to return the ID value of what was inserted. So we're going to have to return a URI with an ID appended to it. And so we're going to have to return URI.parse, the base path, which is our employee's path, and then slash, and then we're going to pass in the ID. And the ID, remember, was returned from the add method. The database insert method returns the ID. We're going to send the ID back to the client. We're required to do that from the interface. So our delete method is going to take a URI, a selection, and string selection args. We want to check that URI. And before we check the URI, we just want to create a local variable called rows deleted, because this has to be returned on how many deleted rows. And we want to open up the database first because we don't want to open it twice and have duplicate code for each URI match. We could support both. We're going to only allow deletes from a single user or a single record. This is passing in the ID. And we're going to match case 2. This is when they pass the ID in for the content URI, the client. And if they pass the ID in, we're going to simply update or call the delete method with that ID. So for case 2, we're going to create a string ID because we need to first parse out the ID from the URI that was passed in. Because remember, the client's going to pass in the ID that they want to update in the path. So we can say URI.getLastPath segment. This will parse out the ID. We can then use that in the delete method. We're going to call database helper with the ID equal to the ID, and we're going to say selection args equal to none. So text_utils.empty is checking the selection. So you can pass in an ID with a where clause, or you can just pass in a single ID. So now that we've implemented that, we want to also implement a default case that will throw an exception if they try to call a different content URI. We're not going to allow multiple deletes for deleting many rows unless they pass in selection args. It's just not necessary. We're going to only delete a single record. We want to notify our clients of a change, then return the rows deleted. So we can just say return rows deleted. So now we have our delete method implemented. The last method we have to implement is the update. The update method is going to be similar to the delete. The update is going to take our URI, content values, selection, and selection args. We're going to create a local variable for rows updated. and we're going to open the database. We're then going to need to match the appropriate URI. And we're going to support both cases here. We're only going to call one. So if the user passes in all the employees to update all the employees, we're just going to call update with all the values. If the URI is only updating a single employee, we're going to get out the ID passed in. We're going to check if the selection is empty. If it is, we don't need to set the selection args. If it isn't, we're going to set the selection args. The selection plus the selection args. Remember, selection is the where clause where you have a column name equal to a question mark. The selection args interpolate the question mark. So we're calling the update values on our helper, and if we don't get past in either one of those cases, we're going to throw an exception. Last thing we need to do is we need to notify the change and then return the rows updated. Something like that. We're almost done. The last thing we need to do is we need to modify our manifest file to identify this application as a provider. So if we go to manifest and we specify, we want to add the permission label, permission element with our name and our authorities, and we also want to set a couple attributes for exported. So in the manifest, after the inside of the application tag, we don't want to end the application, we can add the provider element. We say provider, we set the name equal to my.myProvider, which is our class name. We have our authority set to the package name, which is com.example.jfedin.myContentProvider. We set the enabled property to true, exported to true, and grant URI permissions to true. And then we want to end our application. So now we'll want to build, make sure that we can build, and then we want to install in the emulator. And now we're done with our content provider. We've implemented everything that we need to implement. So this is an application that will need to be installed on the device or the emulator. It doesn't have an activity. The last thing we really need to do is we need to change the configuration when we install the app. So we can go to the run method and we can say edit configurations. Inside edit configurations for this app, we can say we don't need a default activity. So we can just say nothing. This will install our app and it will be running on the device without an activity when we install it. It will be installed. It won't always be running, but it will be installed. And then when we put this on the emulator, we can use it. So we should install this on the emulator, I guess, just to make sure we don't forget when we use our client. So we covered a lot in this lecture. We've covered creating our contract class and exposing it and importing it as a module in another activity so we can access those static variables. We created our database helper class inside our content provider. That was pretty basic. And then we created our own content provider by subclassing the content provider and implementing the CRUD operations in the onCreate and the getType. The lecture is running quite a bit long here, so we're going to have another lecture where we're going to use this content provider. We're going to create the application that we created for our database helper or our database example application to modify, update, and insert and delete records. The only difference is we're not going to access the SQLite Open Helper class. We're going to use our content provider. So thank you.